The Toronto Maple Leafs apparently know what the Devils' weak spot is and were able to capitalize on it. We'll talk about that. The Oilers' continued resilience and a very controversial hit in the Flyers versus Islanders game last night. All of that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone, and thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner from Locked On Flyers, and I'm here each and every Friday with Gil Martin of Locked On Islanders. You can find us on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to get our latest episodes as soon as they're available here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Gil, it is convenient that the two of us are here to discuss the Tsyplakov hit on Ryan Poehling. We're going to do that later in the show, as well as get to the Oilers' comeback win. But I want to talk about Devils versus Leafs from last night, and really interesting game. Of course, the return of Sheldon Keefe to Toronto was a big storyline there. And, the Leafs found a way to win this game.
They did. And it went to overtime. So, both teams are going to get points. And William Nylander comes up with the game winner after the Leafs tie it in the last 4 minutes and change.
Yeah. And we're going to hear from David Morrissey of Locked On Leafs to get the Leafs side of things, and then we'll get into what the Devils' deal is here.
The Toronto Maple Leafs pulled off a gutsy comeback victory over the New Jersey Devils in overtime. David Morrissey here from Locked On Leafs. Austin Matthews and William Nylander led the charge offensively, something this Leafs team has desperately needed as they ended their 3-game losing streak, and they also improved to 3-0 against former head coach Sheldon Keefe. This game was going to be a tough one for the Leafs as they were without John Tavares, who is set to be out week to week with a lower body injury, but that proved to galvanize this team and give them a chance to end this losing streak. Next up for the Leafs is a showdown against the Montreal Canadiens. We'll break all that down on the next episode of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yeah, so interesting to hear that perspective about it, that, it was really like the Leafs that had to work hard here in order to be the team to win it. And, I agree with that to a large extent. He also mentioned the record against Sheldon Keefe, which was, a nice little dig there, of course. But one of the interesting things about this game is that there were 3 power play goals in the game total, 2 from the Devils and 1 from the Leafs. So penalty kills not exactly working to either team's advantage.
No, not at all. And look, to Toronto's credit, they put 41 shots on goal against Jacob Markstrom. And Markstrom was able to keep the Devils in the game because they were outshot, 41-24 in this contest.
Right. And that's a huge part of it, right? That, you get that kind of offensive pressure, like it's going to happen at some point in the game. Interestingly, they have the same number of points now at 58. And obviously in different divisions and in the top 3, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but I think just given where they both are, the matchup was interesting to see that. But a big difference between these two teams, the Leafs are 6-4 in their last 10. The Devils are now 3-4-3. So, and of that last stretch of games, the last 4 games for the New Jersey Devils have gone into extra time. So they just lose to the Leafs in OT. They lost to the Panthers in a shootout. They won 3-2 in overtime against Tampa. And then they lost in overtime to the Rangers, 3-2 in overtime prior to that. And the Devils, this is their Achilles heel, right? If a game is super close or goes into extra time, chances are you are going to beat the New Jersey Devils, no matter how good this team is, overall. They've had 7 games go to overtime this season. The Devils have only won 2 of them. They lost the one game, they went to a shootout in, and, like, I have to wonder, is that the strategy? Just take the Devils to overtime and you're gonna win?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is working. I mean, whether it's a strategy or not, the outcome is working. Look, I mean, I cover the Islanders. That is a team that struggles in overtime, struggles in
Right.
shootouts. So, there is something to that strategy in general, that there are certain teams that do not fare as well 3-on-3, or do not fare as well in the skills competition. And if you can get them to overtime, you have a big advantage. Doesn't guarantee you anything,
Of
obviously,
course.
but you certainly, the odds tilt into your favor, because you look at the lineup. I mean, both of these teams have some really skilled players, but boy,
Right.
uh,
I know, that's the thing. That's
yeah,
the whole thing, right? You
yeah,
look at the forward skill on this New Jersey Devils team, and you look at, in that game against the Leafs, Jack Hughes scores. Nico Hischier gets 2. Like,
right.
Nico Hischier has turned into a tremendous player, right? And yet, right?
But there is a strategy to overtime. There is a way to approach overtime, and apparently the Devils haven't mastered it yet. And overtime is now that we're how many years into this 3-on-3, it's all about puck possession and holding on to the puck. And I can't count how many times successful teams in overtime skate into the zone, leave the zone, regroup, change on the fly, or don't change on the fly. But the most important thing is you control the puck, you control the outcome. And if you know, you rarely see teams back up and leave the zone voluntarily 5-on-5. But in overtime, it happens very, very frequently. And it just looks like the Devils haven't mastered how to handle the overtime strategically.
Yeah, I think that could be a big part of it. I think, the Devils, because of the record in overtime, obviously those are all one goal games, right? So you look at the entirety of their one goal games this season, and they're 6-4-6. So they're on the losing side of things overall. Even though they do have 6 wins, you have those 6 overtime losses that kind of cancel each other out, and then just 4 regulation losses at that one goal margin. And, there's something to that. If you keep the Devils close, you have a really good shot of winning the game against them. I think, you look at when there's a shootout, or sorry, when there's a shutout in the games with the Devils, they're on the losing side of it 6 times and the winning side of it 5 times. So
Hmm.
that's another little side note related to the Devils. But I think,
But
yeah, you just keep it close and you got a shot.
keep in mind, though, that that will not apply in the playoffs. That there
True.
is no 3-on-3, there is no
Yeah.
shootout. When it really matters, and barring a big collapse, the Devils are going to be in the playoffs.
Yeah.
You know, you can't use that strategy once the games go up a notch. Let's put it that way.
Sure, and that's why I was trying to translate it to a one-goal game, close game, right?
Right,
And look at the
right.
bigger picture there, because that's absolutely the point to be made, heading into the playoffs. You're spot on that front, and I just think, it seems like, based on everything and how the Washington Capitals have performed, that the Devils are gonna be pretty locked into that 2 slot in the Metro division. I can't see that changing. Stranger things have happened, but especially because the Devils have been on the wrong end of games in hand the entire season since they
Yeah.
started in Europe, and they're still there, which the schedule crazy. I don't get that. But all that being said, I think that the Devils are going to have a really big challenge on their hand in the playoffs if the games against them are close.
Yeah, and part of that, I think, is also, this is still a fairly young team. So they're
Mhm.
still learning how to win those close games. It is a separate skill, I think, winning close, highly contested games. It requires maybe a different approach, and you got to learn it, and sometimes you got to learn it by losing.
Yeah. Well, There are two other teams that are trying to figure out how to be in the best position heading into the playoffs. They are the Colorado Avalanche and the Edmonton Oilers. We're going to talk about their game coming up next.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win that first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. And hockey fans, you can also check out the latest odds for your favorite team in their next game on FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
So we've talked a lot about the Oilers this season and could they get back to the Stanley Cup final? Is this the same team that they had last year? And they've had their ups and downs for sure this season so far. And with everybody having a jam-packed schedule this January because of the Four Nations tournament, the Oilers were on the back half of a road back-to-back last night, their third game in 4 nights against the powerhouse Colorado Avalanche. And the Oilers have come out of it winning all 3 in the road trip and 4 in a row.
Yeah, they have really been resilient and they have looked really strong. And it seems like they are clicking right now here in this middle part of the season.
Yeah, and we're going to hear from Nick at Locked On Oilers to hear a little bit about that game against the Avs.
Having the conviction and the internal strength to say, it's only 3 goals, this is doable. What do we always say in hockey? Give us 1 going into the intermission. We only need 2. 2 is a lot easier than 3. We chip away, we chip away, we chip away. If we get it to 1, all we need is 1. We already did the hard part. We scored 2 straight and we didn't give 1 up. All we need is 1 more. You tie this game and then you're buzzing. At that point, the confidence you're going to get from scoring 3 straight goals unanswered, the heat that other team is going to be feeling.
Yeah, so that's exactly what happened in that game. And, you had 3 goals for the Avs in a 5-shot sequence in the first period. Does not seem like things are going to go Edmonton's way, right? Nathan MacKinnon had 2 of them. He was on natural hat trick watch in the first period of that game.
Yeah.
But Nick just talked about that 1 goal. Well, that 1 goal was by Victor Arvidsson. He scores on a monster shot with less than a minute to go in that first. And that was absolutely the catalyst that the Oilers needed going into the second period, right?
It was. Goals in the last minute of a period really changed the momentum of a game. They just seem to have a bigger impact. First minute of a period, last minute of a period,
Right.
it just seems to have an outsized impact on the momentum of the game. So you're down 3-0. You get that first goal back in the final minute. You're suddenly much more optimistic that you can pull off the comeback, and that's exactly what the Edmonton Oilers did. And yet to do it on the road in Denver on the second day of a back-to-back, that is just such an impressive performance. And you know what? Credit to Stuart Skinner, who after that shaky start did settle down and blank a very talented Avalanche team the rest of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you look at that second period for the Edmonton Oilers where they get 2 goals in there. And Brett Kulak scored an incredible goal from the point. It was an amazing shot after a hand keep to keep the puck in play prior to the shot. And then, of course, who else but Connor McDavid scored after a minute-long pressure in the offensive zone by the Oilers. It wore the Avalanche out, and almost an easy put-in for Connor McDavid at that point. On the flip side, like at that point, Blackwood, since arriving with the Colorado Avalanche, had not had more than 2 goals scored against him in any of the 13 games thus far played for the Colorado Avalanche. Now that threshold has been broken.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't going to keep it up every game, but he's been very,
Sure.
very impressive for the Avs since he came over.
Yeah.
But last night, after a very fast start, he was unable to protect that lead. And, emotionally, how are the Avalanche going to respond to this? I think, from their perspective, blowing a 3-0 lead at home, how do you respond emotionally to that?
Well, true. And then Edmonton only had 4 shots on goal in that third period, but just 1 shot was all it took from Evan Bouchard to get that game winner on another heads up play from Connor McDavid prior to that shot. And so you have to be thinking like, okay, we play well defensively. There's also a big reason why Blackwood hasn't had more than 2 goals against in a game
Right.
until last night, right? Because they have a strong defense in Colorado playing in front of him, but they work their butts off to only allow 4 shots on goal in that third period, and they still lose the game. Like,
Yeah.
that's got to be super rough, right?
It's got to be very, very frustrating, and even more so, how do the players, the skaters, view the goalie? Hey, we held them to 4 shots. You've got to do your job, and you didn't. That's why I say how they
I don't know.
respond is vital.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the play for that goal, and you're like, who could he have stopped it? Maybe. Is it
Maybe.
likely for him to have stopped it? No.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it was a really great pass, got everybody moving, too slow in the other direction. Like, what are you gonna do at that point? But I think the onus is on the Avalanche to be like, "Okay, well, then why didn't we come back and score even 1 more goal in
Right.
that game?" Right?
Yeah, I mean, they had 40 plus minutes to try to add to that lead and or to retake the lead after Edmonton tied it, and they weren't able to do it. So, yeah, there's plenty of reasons why you blow a 3-0 lead, and it's got to be super frustrating in Colorado. It yeah, and it also will give Edmonton confidence if these teams ever meet in the playoffs at some point. The fact that they were down 3-0 and were able to come back on the road and win this game, they'll remember that. This is one of those games you think about when the chips are
Yeah.
down in the future.
Right. And, the Colorado Avalanche had 2 power play opportunities in the remainder of the game, could not capitalize on either of them. So there's something to that as well. It wasn't just 5-on-5 hockey. And so I think, it's a good comeback win for the Edmonton Oilers and shows that, in a tough situation and in a grinding series, they do have the goods to get back to where they were last season in the playoffs. And, this is a playoff style game, and they were absolutely up for it.
Yeah, and I don't think the Oilers, people who don't watch the Oilers very often, they'll always think, oh, it's McDavid, oh, it's Draisaitl, it's Zach Hyman. No. There's a lot more to that team than just the
Yep.
stars, and they play well as a team. And when they're successful, they can shut you down defensively. So don't overlook what the Edmonton Oilers are capable of doing. They're more than just an exciting offensive team.
Right. I mean, Evan Bouchard, getting that game-winning goal, also had an assist in that game on the McDavid goal. So, they are getting contributions from other players in here, to your point. And I think, I think the road will be harder for them than it was the previous year. but you also look at the Florida Panthers and their ability to come back from a cup final to actually win it the next year. And it's got to be some sort of motivation for them, right?
It does. It does. That and the fact that, there hasn't been a cup in Edmonton since what, 1990? So they're due. It's time.
All right. Well, it is somewhat fortuitous that the two of us host the Friday show for Locked On NHL, as there was a bit of a controversy last night between the Philadelphia Flyers, whom I cover on Locked On Flyers, and the New York Islanders, which of course Gil covers on Locked On Islanders. We're going to get into that Tsyplakov hit on Ryan Poehling and each of our perspectives on it coming up next. All right, Gil. So I don't think we're going to throw down about this by
No.
any stretch of the imagination. I think we actually kind of agree for the most part on what happened here with this hit. And, Tsyplakov hit Ryan Poehling in the first period of the game last night. Poehling left the game, did not return. I don't see him playing in at least the next game, but, to be determined as of recording on what the severity of that injury is. And I think, you look at that hit from every single angle and you're going to come up with a different conclusion as
Yep.
to what happened. It is
Yep.
the weirdest scenario I think we've seen in a long time with a hit like this, right?
Yeah, it is strange. When I first saw it live in real time, I thought right away, 5-minute misconduct,
Yep.
5-minute major game misconduct. He's done. He'll get a call from the Department of Player Safety. Then you see the other replay and you're like, well, he got mostly shoulder. Did he get all shoulder? Did he get just a little bit of the head? And you look at it from 2 or 3 different angles and you'll have 2 or 3 different opinions. It is a very close play. I've been watching Maxim Tsyplakov play all year. He is not a dirty player. I don't think he was intentionally going after the head of Ryan Poehling. The problem is he did probably get some head on that, and that's the kind of play that the NHL is trying to discourage. But here's the weird thing. They go to Toronto, they go to the war room there to review it. They say no penalty at all. And
Right.
then the next day, the Department of Player Safety is calling him up to discuss a possible fine or suspension. So which one is it? That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, I find that to be maddening. And I think, on the Islanders side of things, and I think on the general NHL side of things, right? That's the confusing part, because if there's no penalty, I know they can review things afterwards, to add supplemental discipline. But
Right.
if they review it and there's no penalty, I can see why there's, an objection to then having a hearing. Now, you can have a hearing and have no penalty at the end of the hearing, right?
Rare,
Because
but yes.
it is possible. Obviously, we won't know that until after the hearing, which is happening after we record this. But I think, in the multiple angles, it does seem like that the intent was to go shoulder, but that Tsyplakov is significantly taller than Poehling. And he has to know that going into the hit and control his body and control his actions. And so by throwing what looks like a shoulder, it actually hits Ryan Poehling in the chin a little bit, and that's what jerks Ryan Poehling's head, and then he goes down, and it's all kinds of bad, right? And we talk about in high sticking penalties where, the stick is an extension of your arm and you have to be in control of it. So even if it seems accidental and the stick hits someone up high, you still get penalized for it.
You are responsible for your
You are
stick.
responsible for your stick, just
Right.
like you should be responsible for your arm and your shoulder when you throw a hit like that. And that's the angle I come from at it, is that I think it should have been called during the game. And I don't know what conclusion they're going to come to about a, a play that does not get called during the game,
Yeah.
but and isn't just a straight up fine kind of thing. This is actually, like, in theory, could have been a major penalty. Like, how do they make the leap from no penalty to
Yeah.
potential supplemental discipline after the fact. I don't know. That's a really, really interesting thing that has
We
happened
need some
here.
consistency.
Yeah.
If it is hard for me to understand how you suspend a guy but don't penalize him. And it would be one thing if they didn't go to Toronto for the review, but the fact that
Mhm.
they went for the review and in essence cleared him of any wrongdoing by not calling. I mean, they could have just said, you know what, not a 5-minute major, it's a 2-minute minor. And then even then, I would say, okay, we clearly have a penalty here. That opens it up for supplemental discipline if they then later review it and find something wrong. But they cleared him of any penalty. So to then turn
Yeah.
around and have a hearing is a little, well, to put it nicely, it's inconsistent. That's my nice way of putting
Yeah.
it.
And, like, of course, now I'm mad because Scott Lawton got fined the max $5K for cross-checking Tsyplakov later in the game because
Right,
the officials did nothing about the hit and put the onus on the players
right.
to discipline themselves. And this is what happens. And now Scott Lawton is out 5K.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing about it is this, and maybe this is sort of the old time hockey guy in me. Siplikov should have just dropped the gloves at some point and just
Yeah.
gotten it
And
over with.
didn't.
And now these two teams play twice more in the next 2 weeks. Don't
Uh-huh.
think this is over. This is not over. If you stand up for yourself and just say, okay, I made this hit. I may not have intended to hurt anybody. This is what happened. You want a piece of me? Let's get this over with. You put it in the rearview mirror and it's done. Now this thing drags on. He's got the hearing. Lawton is out $5,000. Poehling is injured, and hopefully, all everything else aside, I hope that this is not a serious injury that doesn't have
Right.
long-term repercussions for his health. I mean, concussions are not, good things to have. It's just a big mess. So I just think this was poorly handled across the board by the officials, by the league, by Tsyplakov, by both teams. I just think they could have handled it a lot better. But do you think that the Tsyplakov hit was a motivating factor for the way the Flyers came out in the second period?
Oh, 100%. I think interestingly, John Tortorella will tell you that's not the case, or in terms of him particularly, like mentioning it or using it as a motivational tool between periods. He's like, no, like I don't have to motivate them or change focus. They're a tight knit group. They'll do this themselves. And they did. That's the thing. And I think, you know, that's the kind of team the Flyers are, is that if something like this happens, they're going to rally around their guy because they absolutely truly support each other through thick and thin. And this is how this Philadelphia Flyers locker room operates. So, I think it absolutely led to the Flyers winning the game overall. That's for sure. And I think that I think the period break allowed the team to refocus a little bit,
Hmm.
but it wasn't something that was, put on them from Tortorella. That's for sure.
Right. And yet, the Islanders, I wish they would stick up for their teammates more frequently than they have shown so far in the first half of the year. And, the Islanders outplayed the Flyers in the first period. And then in the second period, they were flat. And they stopped skating. They stopped hitting. They weren't forechecking. And the Flyers just took control of the game and scored 3 unanswered goals.
Yeah. And that's ultimately, I think, there were some downtimes in the later part of that game for the Flyers for sure, especially at the beginning of that third period. But I think the other little kind of unsung hero in this game a little bit is Morgan Frost, because Ryan Poehling was a faceoff guy for the Philadelphia Flyers, and with him out, Morgan Frost took some additional faceoffs and won a lot of them. He was above 62% in faceoffs in this game. And, when you lose a guy like Poehling, who, when he's on the fourth line, I don't think he plays as well, but they'd moved him up a little bit at some points during the games recently. And I think he thrives when he's on a higher line, and he does better at faceoffs, and he does better across the board. And so for Morgan Frost to kind of pick up that slack is yet another example of going to bat for your teammates. That's not necessarily a fight.
Yeah, it is. And next man up, right? So that
Yep.
they did that and it worked, and the Flyers ended up with 2 points in regulation, I might add.
Yep. Yep. All right. Well, to be continued. We'll see what happens with the hearing for Tsyplakov, and if we get any further explanation. I think the explanation for the decision is going to be fascinating to follow. But that will do it for today's show. Of course, Gail will be back on Monday talking to hosts from around the Locked On NHL channel with the latest going on from their teams. And thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your next listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert. Get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a great weekend, everyone.